Hey everybody, it's 10:30, so I think we're going to kick things off. First and foremost, thank you so much for swinging by today. I know we're kind of in a room that's off to the side a little. It's a little tough to find at times, so I appreciate you guys making the trip. My name is Josh Grunzweig. I'm a malware reverser with the Unit 42 group here at Alto Networks. I spend most of my days down in my basement, not to be too much of a stereotype, reversing and analyzing malware at a very low level. Really, I'm afforded the opportunity to talk about or look at all sorts of different types of malware, whether it's very targeted, remote access Trojan type stuff versus something like commodity malware. I'm able to look at things affecting all sorts of different platforms. So Windows-based stuff, Mac-based, mobile, as well as Linux, and by and large, an extension of that, things that affect the Internet of Things, which is what today's talk's about. So the Internet of Things, or IoT, is, I think, a topic that's on a lot of folks' minds, certainly in recent years, both in the general public as well as within the security community itself. To really discuss the Internet of Things, I think we really have to take a look back at the Internet and how it's evolved over the past 20 or so years to really understand how we came to be at the point we are right now. So like when you look at the Internet, 15, 20 years ago, it was a pretty different beast. I mean, it pretty much consisted of a much smaller number of devices. These devices typically fit the bill of being a small subset of types of devices, whether it's printers, routers, networking gear, servers, desktops, and the like. And then we start to see it change and evolve. I mean, financial-based payment systems really enter the mix. We start to see, credit cards are obviously being rapidly adopted in that time. So we start to see that change, followed by industries such as manufacturing and healthcare, which have historically had their systems or devices previously not connected to the Internet, start to make this shift, where previously these things were on isolated networks, and they start to merge, finding themselves being connected to the Internet. As we continue, we start to see this rapid emergence of end users entering the foray, if you will. Home-based networking systems start to see rapid spikes in growth. And of course, the surge of mobile devices in the past 10 or so years. I remember like 8 years ago, or however long it was, standing in line for the first iPhone, being fortunate enough to get one, and I'm at the airport, have it out, and like listening to music or something, and I see people like nearby kind of like staring at me, going like, oh, that guy's got an iPhone, and they're like impressed with me or something, I don't know. But you look at it today, and it's almost like that's completely become a 180. It's almost like if you see a Razr flip phone, you're like the weirdo of the room, because everyone's like, well, gosh, that's not even a smartphone. How do you even get that? As we progress, we start to see, certainly in the past 5 or so years, this huge influx of home automation, which includes an extraordinarily large number of devices. So we see everything from gaming and media servers and locks, smart locks. You can have it set up so that when you're within a certain GPS range, your house will automatically unlock for you, so you don't even have to turn the key. Smart thermostats. I myself just bought a new one, gosh, like 4 days ago. And yes, they even make smart toilets. I don't know why, but they do exist. So Gartner is great. They tell us all sorts of interesting facts. They estimated that in 2016, so just last year, there was approximately 6 or so billion devices on the Internet. And they also estimate that by 2020, this number will rise to as many as 20 billion. And you think about it, in 4 years, that's almost 4 times. That's almost a 4-time multiplier in growth, which is pretty darn amazing. So when given these facts, these estimates, I was, I forgot one thing, sorry. Just to add one more thing into the mix of the Internet of Things, all of a sudden then we also have cars becoming connected. I don't know how many people keep up with new research, but just I think it was a year or two ago, there was some great research at Black Hat discussing hacking the Jeep model or manufacturer. So back to my other point. Given this information, 20 billion devices in 2020, what exactly is connected to the internet right now? So I basically asked myself this question in the hopes of determining, just what exactly is out there. So I took a subset of ports and protocols. In this case, I looked at FTP, I looked at Telnet, NetBIOS, port 81, 82, and port 8000. So all in all, I probably looked at about 10 million or so data points. Actually, probably close to 20. So when we actually break it down and look at, what exactly is connected to the internet, specifically on port, FTP, port 21, we see a lot of what we'd expect, typical FTP protocols. But we also start to see some really interesting things as well. Webcams, for whatever reason, are given FTP services. We also see other manufacturers. We see NAS devices connecting the internet with FTP open. I mean, FTP is like a super old protocol. The fact that new devices are coming online with this service exposed is frankly quite concerning. Telnet's kind of the same thing. We see a lot of what we expect, networking gear. But we also have, again, IP cameras, DVRs. We've got these two, probably somewhat unknown device types, ZEM800 and BK Tool. So these are actually devices that are responsible for aggregating, correlating physical security devices. So they take cameras, they take locks, maybe they take access controls, and they bring it all together so that end users or administrators can monitor and manage these devices from a single point. NetBIOS, an amazing thing. Sure enough, we see, by and large, more of the same. And once again, we start to see really bizarre anomalies, like Dune, which is a media server. We see Yuku Samba, which I apologize, I don't necessarily know exactly what it is, but based on my research, it looks to be a Chinese media service, representing roughly almost a tenth of the NetBIOS names available. Minecrafter. So individuals are spinning up Minecraft servers with NetBIOS exposed, to play their favorite game. So port 80 and 81 is almost a 180 from what we've seen up until now, because these ports are specifically used, by and large, by what you would consider to be IoT devices. Pretty much half of all instances of this port is being dominated by IP, cameras, CCTVs, and DVRs. So for port 8000, as you'd expect, we're seeing lots of proxies. We're also seeing lots of routers. And we're also seeing things like the XXTER or XXTER home control system. So again, an instance where someone is taking a device intended for controlling their home, and it's given internet access. So while looking at port 8000, I made an interesting discovery. So I had about 2,000 or so instances where I saw a home-grade router that looked to be almost exclusively in the Iran region. Went by the name of Zyxel, or ZYXEL. What caught me off guard, though, is well, I'll get into that in just a minute, but it turned out that port 8000 was kind of a one-off. What actually was used by this device, by and large, was a different port. And when I looked at that port, I found about 11,000 instances. Now, the thing about this device is that when you went to its login screen for the configuration, it required a password, but it was auto-populated, meaning it literally entered it for you with the value of user. So 4 letters, lowercase, and it works. So, not condoning anything, but I think it's maybe interesting to be aware that there's about 11,000 instances of a home-based router sitting in Iran that require pretty much one of the weakest passwords I've seen in years. So what's the big deal? All these devices are out there. You ask someone on the street, you're like, does it concern you that someone might be able to access your home's thermostat or the camera that's watching your garage or your lawn? And they'll tell you, no, it's why would I care? Why would someone be interested in taking control of that? Well, the problem is there's a lot of issues with IoT. By and large, the majority of these devices are what I call set it and forget it. So you get your brand new, smart toilet or whatever, your home thermostat, your smart sprinkler system. You configure it initially. Maybe you change the password, maybe you don't. And you set it up, and it runs, and it works, and you're good to go. I mean, if your sprinkler system's working, are you going to go back and start playing with it every day, every week? Are you going to go back and check to see if there are any updates to that device? Which leads me into another issue, is the lack of security updates. I mean, oftentimes, these devices are not updated frequently. If they are updated, it might be a manual process where you have to specifically tell the device that you want to update, causes downtime, so on and so forth. This is just something that isn't frequently taking place. These devices are also pretty easy to obtain. They're consumer grade in most cases. They're usually valued at relatively low prices. It's not hard to go to Best Buy, pick one up, take it apart, figure out how it works, dissect it to your leisure to determine, does this device have any issues? Some of the problems that really stem from IoT really also are specific to the users that handle these devices, that own these devices, as well as the manufacturers creating them. So I think it's a safe assumption that a majority of IoT users are just sort of your layman people, your enthusiasts that procure these devices, and security is not really at the forefront of their minds. On that same token, the manufacturers have very different goals, and security is oftentimes very low on the priority list. So there's been such an insurgence of these types of devices in the past 5 or so years that manufacturers are really racing against the clock to try to get to market. They want a product that works, and they want a product that users can purchase. And security is oftentimes not something that they necessarily care about, at least initially. And then, of course, there's sort of the issues that come with default passwords. Many of these devices don't require you to change them. There's been instances where the manufacturers actually have a backdoor password that they don't tell anyone about until some lowly researcher discovers it and it makes the news. And they're rife with vulnerabilities in many cases. And that, again, sort of just stems from, and I'm not trying to pick on manufacturers, but it's just the nature of the beast that security is just not at the forefront of their minds in most cases. I mean, a quick search of SCADA, in this case, vulnerabilities, provides just a wealth of interesting results. I mean, we've got full access to the system in this case. We've got directory traversal issues. I mean, issues that have existed 15 years ago are once again kind of surfacing in these devices. Unrestricted file upload vulnerabilities. You look at our things like, in this case, IP cameras or CCTVs, and it's just more and more of the same. The ability to create new admins, the ability to execute malicious scripts, or finally, again, hard-coded root password. So I'm often asked, why would criminals target these devices? What's in it for them? What's the point? How are they making a profit? And right now, at least, the majority of these devices are being leveraged in botnets. So criminals are going out there and aggregating access to as many devices as possible and forming these, in some cases, very large botnets. Now, the botnets, in turn, can be used for a number of other things. It's not uncommon for the initial attacker to create this botnet and then sell it as a service to other, miscreants. So he'll say, you give me $100 a day, and you can rent my botnet. You can attack whoever you want, and it'd be just a recurring service. There's also other instances where these botnets might be used for hacktivist motivations. With the political climate being somewhat hot right now, there's definitely instances where bad guys may use these to really push their political agendas. And certainly a big thing lately is extortion. So criminals will reach out to organizations and say, look, I can take your website down for days. If you don't give me $5,000 in Bitcoin, I'm going to completely perform a denial of service against your website. You're not going to be able to make any profits through your business, and it's going to be really catastrophic for you. And if they don't pay this ransom, in some cases, the attacks are carried out. And speaking of Bitcoin, that's kind of a newer thing. So the mining of financial cryptocurrencies. So what was it, 2 days ago, I think Bitcoin hit about $3,000 for each. Other mining or other currencies are also gaining in popularity and in price. I think Ethereum just hit 400. There's definitely money to be made, and when you think about the vast computing powers that may be available when you aggregate, hundreds of thousands of devices together, there's a potential that criminals can leverage them to really generate some profits. So that being said, those are sort of the ways they make money. What's actually happened to date? Unfortunately, in the past few years, at the very least, a lot of unfortunate events have taken place. Now, while it hasn't been, natural disaster scale panic, they've been, unfortunately, in some cases, very significant. So to kick things off, let's go back to 2014. Some of you folks might remember the time. I mean, this was kind of around that time where Anonymous and Anti-Sec and some of these other sort of little hacking groups were really making the rounds in the news, going after specific organizations, pushing all their data they found to pay spins, so on and so forth. So Lizard Squad was sort of in that same ballpark, in that same realm. If I remember correctly, I believe they were sort of a spin-off off the Anonymous movement. So this was a group that had really close ties to the Darkcode hacking forum, which some folks in the audience may be familiar with. And that's actually somewhat interesting for a reason I'll get into in just a few. But this was one of the groups that was early in the adoption of IoT-based botnets. And in this case, they claim to have taken down the PlayStation and Xbox online services on Christmas. So you imagine you're a kid or an adult, you get your new PlayStation, your new Xbox, you get your new game, maybe the new Halo came out or something. Maybe I'm showing my age there. And you load it up, and you're excited. You say, I can't wait to play this thing. And you can't log in. All the services are down. They were down for days. In fact, I think, if I remember correctly, the only reason this was even resolved in the first place was because the owner of a popular file sharing service based down, I think, in Australia or those regions, offered to pay these guys money to stop their attacks. So again, it's a botnet made entirely of IoT devices, in this case, CCTVs, webcams, and the like, and it just wreaked havoc against the PlayStation and Xbox Live services. Now, so Darkcode was actually taken down a little while after that by, I think, the FBI. So it's unclear. I mean, you could make inferences that maybe that was a significant event. Maybe the heat was on, so to speak, for these guys. I mean, they gained so much attention. And the claim was the reason they DDoS these services was because it was almost like a promotion for their botnet. I mentioned sometimes these guys will sell their botnets, resell them, if you will, or provide it as a paid service, sort of software as a service type deal. So this was sort of apparently a promotion. They wanted to get the word out that they have incredible botnets that can take down these amazingly popular services. So it was a bit of a promotion. But as I said, Darkcode was taken down, the forum itself, shortly after. So it's certainly possible that they might have gotten wind, coupled with the fact that, this was in the news quite a bit. They were sort of under the microscope, so to speak. So about a month later, wouldn't you know it, like the source code to their botnet client gets pushed out online, which is just, it's one of those things that as a researcher, I'm always like, oh, cool, I get to look at the actual source code, I can see if there's any comments or anything, but it's really got such a destructive nature because all of a sudden, anyone else that's out there, wannabe bad guys or actual bad guys, can take this source code, modify it to their whims, And before you know it, you've got plenty of other variants of this malware family floating around for years to come. So another instance took place in June, a couple years later. And maybe it's important to backtrack real quick. So this was really kind of a significant event because all of a sudden it really put the spotlight on the dangers of IoT device botnets. I think prior to this, the general public didn't really have a lot of care or appreciation for how destructive these things can be. But all of a sudden you take down their video games and they get really, it catches their attention pretty quickly, coupled with the fact that it was over the Christmas and holiday break. So a couple years later, and I'm just kind of cherry picking a few instances of kind of notable use cases, but trust me when I say stuff happened between then and this period in time. There was absolutely additional botnets that took place, other attacks. But sure enough, in June of 2016, we see yet another CCTV-based botnet. This one was kind of interesting in that it leveraged IPv6, which really hasn't been the case as much, at least yet. So it was kind of unique in that regard. And we can see the distribution here. I mean, certainly North America garnered a lot of the hosts, the victims, the bots. But really, it was globally spread. And that's really a tough thing about botnets, too. I mean, they're so dynamic in nature, hosts coming online, going offline, IP addresses shifting, changing. The geographic dispersity of where the hosts reside makes it for a very difficult thing to combat. So a couple months after that, it wouldn't be an IoT talk if we didn't talk about Mirai, right? We see the Mirai botnet sort of surface. Now Mirai, again, botnet made almost entirely out of IoT devices, CCTVs, DVRs, printers in this case. The actual node count is really sort of up in the air. I've heard claims that it's as low as like 25,000. I've heard claims that it's as much as like 1.5 million. So in this case, I went with 150,000, just to give you a rough estimate about how many nodes might be associated with this botnet at this time. Like most botnets, it runs on Linux. It runs on the various Linux-based architectures that we'll see. And what's cool about Mirai, too, is that it really had a wealth of attacks. So it wasn't just HTTP floods. They also leveraged things like TCP, UDP, DNS-based attacks, and the Valve source engine. So not sure how many people in the audience are PC gamers, but Valve is a pretty popular PC-based gaming company. So in this case, you could even leverage the Mirai botnet for taking down video game-based services. So if you imagine you're a teenager, you're playing an online game, and you're maybe playing it competitively, and you're losing, and you're just frustrated, you're about to lose the match, you're ready to flip your keyboard and get all angry because you're a teenager and you've got that teenage angst. You might say, well, I'm gonna force my opponent to get disconnected so that I can win the game. So you take your Mirai botnet that you rented for the day and you target the opponent's IP address and you take him down, and all of a sudden, he times out his connection and you've won the game. It sounds kind of silly, but unfortunately it happens all the time in a lot of the more popular online-based games that are out there right now. So you might be wondering, how are these botnets getting access to the devices? You hear about WannaCry and these US government-based exploits, and it's really amazing stuff. But by and large, these botnets are just leveraging default or known credentials. So they're literally just logging into devices that haven't reset their passwords and taking full control over them. In this case, I show a subset of what Mirai is actually looking for. I think there was about 100 or so username password combinations that it would check, if not more. And that's literally all it did. It wasn't using some sophisticated exploit more often than not. It was just logging in and taking over control. So Mirai surfaced, as I said, back in like August. So a couple months later, once again, we see sort of the source code leak. It's posted, in this case, on a forum called hackforums.com. It's a forum of bad guys, somewhat various skill sets. Sometimes on the lower end, it's it's an interesting place. But sure enough, it gets leaked there. And these days, it's available pretty much for anyone to grab. It's the same deal as that lizard stressor, where it's out there, people are modifying it, changing it to their whim. And actually, just a few months ago, we saw some botnet, Mirai botnet stuff that was including the ability to mine Bitcoin. So again, that sort of financial-based cryptocurrency stuff is starting to creep into the mix. Now, Mirai is super interesting because it led, in large part, to another event that took place a month or two later after it initially surfaced. And that was the denial of service attack against the Dyn company. So Dyn, as I'm sure a lot of people here know, represents the DNS services for a number of very, very large organizations. So back in the end of October, Dyn got hit with an absolutely massive denial of service attack, rendering DNS services inaccessible for a very, very large number of organizations. I think Palo Alto Networks is actually somewhat affected by this attack as well. You could still access the services via the IP address, but nobody remembers what the IP address is to various companies when they want to go, if they want to go to Facebook or something, you're not going to type in the IP. About 100,000 bots took place for this one, and it was primarily driven by the Mirai botnet. And so when you look at who was affected, it's a fairly large list. We've got Spotify, we've got GitHub, that was a big one for a lot of the nerdier folks out there. Twitter was huge, obviously. Reddit, that one hit me hard. New York Times, Etsy, Tumblr, PayPal, Comcast, Pinterest, Verizon, EA, so on and so forth. Poor PlayStation got hit again. Poor Sony can't catch a break. And so that was a truly, I think, big wake-up call for a lot of folks. Because all of a sudden, again, the general public gets wind of it. The news of the event spread like wildfire, Folks are saying, why can't I hit Pinterest? Why can't I hit PayPal? Why can't I make payments? And so before you know it, a good chunk of the population understood that, this big attack was going on. And in many cases, they discovered that it was because of these IP cameras, these IoT devices that were contributing to the attacks. So flash forward to March, so just a couple months ago, and we start to see a few other interesting use cases. We see BrickerBot. This was a botnet that was hosted by a fellow that went by the handle Janitor. And apparently Janitor, based on his claims, got fed up with the landscape and said, I'm going to take a scorched earth policy. I'm going to get as much access to devices as I can and completely destroy them so they can't do any harm. So that's what he did. He claimed to have infected as many as 2 million devices. When he logged in, he executed a series of commands that I've listed here. I realize most people can't see it, but basically it's just overwriting various device handles. It's pretty much just completely formatting the disk. It's deleting files. It's doing anything it can to cause destruction, and then limiting the kernel thread count to 1, which I would not recommend. And then it reboots it at the end. So once it reboots, it obviously is not going to be able to start up again. And kind of after it was all said and done, Janitor sort of said, all right, I'll stop. He started to talk with various security researchers, and I think they kind of got him to hold off a bit. However, the damage was kind of done at that point. So about a month after, we see Hajim. So I guess you could interpret BrickerBot as having good intentions, perhaps, even though the methods were not great. Hajim had a similar approach. It was purported to be led by a white hat, a good guy. So this guy would gain access via the same mechanisms that Mirai did, only this time he or she would actually disable ports that are commonly used for these attacks, and they would post messages to the endpoints saying, look, just a white hat securing some systems, signed by the author, and basically he's like, fix your stuff. So kind of a different approach, And it's certainly not something we typically see where sort of the good guys create botnets for this reason. So it's kind of an interesting use case for that reason alone. So that kind of brings us to today. So I want to talk kind of briefly about defenses. How do we stop this stuff? Because obviously it's a problem. It's a recurring thing that's happening time and time again, where these devices are being infected and they're being used for very malicious purposes. How do we stop our sprinklers and our toilets and our wireless routers from becoming the next Skynet, from taking over the world and preventing me from accessing Reddit? Well, just talking generically, I think there's a lot that both organizations and end users can really take steps towards preventing these sort of attacks. I mean, it sounds silly, but changing passwords, it's 2017. We got to make sure that we're not using default passwords in any devices. I know it sounds tough, but we got to keep up with patching if possible. If that means manually doing it, I realize it's not ideal or even feasible in some cases, but maybe reaching out to the manufacturer and saying, look, this is important. I really, really think you guys should be doing auto updates and being vigilant about pushing out new patches. A lot of this really comes down to exposure, though. Understanding what's able to hit the internet. It's unfortunate, but many, many users out there plug in these devices, and they don't realize that you can access the webcam pointing at your infant's crib from the internet. Or they realize that, but they say, oh, it's fine, I got password. It's like 6 characters long, I'm all right. Nobody can access it. So it's, I think, a mixture of education and just knowing what's accessible. Going a step further, segmentation is obviously huge. There's no reason you should have your security cameras on the same network as your domain controller. There's no reason your HVAC system should be on the same network as your critical SQL servers. Taking it a step further, it is Ignite. Let's take a brief minute to talk about Palo Alto Network stuff. For this instance, we're going to use the Mirai as sort of a use case. So really brief overview. At your top right, we've got sort of the infrastructure, including the C2 servers, the reporting servers, as well as the loading mechanism, which is responsible for actually infecting new victims. So the way it works is the Mirai botnet is out there. It's infecting new hosts. It's got a list of hosts that's already infected, which are consistently reporting to a C2 server and a reporting server. So it's waiting for new commands and pushing out its status on a periodic basis. Those bots are also out there scanning the internet for potential new hosts. When a potential new host is found, the loader component pushes down the exploit or what have you, and that victim becomes yet another bot. And that cycle repeats over and over and over again, with the end game of being performing denial of service attacks or what have you. And all this stuff, as I mentioned in the past, is available as an attack as a service in this case. So looking at this, how can Palo Alto Networks really intervene and stop this particular botnet from spreading? Well, there's a few different ways we can really approach this. Certainly on the C2 and the reporting side, we're going to be able to take actions on preventing the network-based communications. Likewise, on the scanning side, it's the same thing. IPS-based signatures, network-based signatures that are going to prevent these scans from taking place. And then on the actual infection itself, we can take measures towards preventing the exploits that are used. So I'd like to sort of take my crystal ball and maybe briefly discuss what I think the future of IoT really holds for us. It's not a positive outlook, but I think we're just going to, unfortunately, at least for the time being, see a lot more botnets in the future. It's just, there's a slow sort of period between, I think, where we are now to where we'll be, where these things are actually secure, hopefully. But in the meantime, we're just going to see more, by and large, of the same attacks. I think we're going to start to see these leveraged a lot more in, what I'll call targeted attacks. So not just the spray and pray method of getting as many victims as possible, but actually targeted attacks towards, say, an organization of interest, using these devices as an initial pivot point to the rest of the network. Ransomware, ransomware is big. I've done a lot of research on ransomware. And honestly, I think we might start to see some of that bleeding into the IoT realm. The ransomware guys have really been updating and evolving over the past couple years. Historically, they'd go after traditional PCs. They started to change tactics as time went on. Everyone's jumping into the game. They all want a piece of the pie, so to speak. So we start to see things like web servers targeted. We start to see database-type systems like Mongo and Elasticsearch gone after. And in some cases, we actually see some IoT-based devices as well. So this is an interesting little tweet that I saw the other week. This is a parking meter that apparently had gotten exposed to the WannaCry attack. So the parking meter actually got infected with the WannaCry ransomware, rendering it unable to be accessed. So I mean, you think about it, and that's got a financial impact. This guy or company that runs this parking lot, all of a sudden nobody can get their tickets validated or leave the parking lot. It has real-world consequences. And then, unfortunately, some of these devices, IoT-based devices, are critical in nature. Certainly you look at things like the healthcare industry, the automotive industry. These are very, in many cases, life or death-based systems. Pacemakers, medical devices, so on and so forth. And I mean, it's unfortunate, but I think we're going to start to see more and more instances where these devices are affected by these types of attacks. There is some legislature or work being done on coming up with a game plan towards really unifying the manufacturers of these devices towards the end game of better security. So I'm hopeful that some of that stuff really gains some traction, and we'll start to see more and more manufacturers really take notice of this potential threat and take action towards correcting it. So I'm going to wrap up. Made okay time. So I guess to conclude, I mean, IoT isn't going anywhere anytime soon. This stuff's only going to grow, as we've seen. We're going to see more and more really wacky devices entering the market. I mean, they have refrigerators now that, for whatever reason, can message you with the contents of the fridge and alert you to, what food is inside of it. I don't know if anyone watches the show Silicon Valley, but they had a fun little episode recently that addressed just that. Smart toasters, literally everything's smart. So I think we're going to start to see more and more of that. They even make smart pipes for your plumbing. Again, I don't fully understand it. I'm not a plumber, but it's interesting to say the least. Education's going to be key, I think, for both end users, understanding that these devices should be taken seriously in the sense that people do want access to them. It's not a weird situation where they say, why would someone care? People care, attackers care. And more often than not, education of the vendors, the manufacturers, is going to be huge. Because unfortunately, more oftentimes than not, the responsibility, I feel, comes down to them. Not enforcing automatic password changes when you first initialize a device. Not automatically patching your devices that are connected. Things of that nature really go a long way. So, like I said, I'm going to wrap things up. I actually wasn't sure if I'd make good time, but I did, so I've got time for questions if anybody has one. We've got a couple of microphones, or if you're nearby, I can just repeat the question. But if anybody has, wishes to get in contact with me, I've got my information up there, and I'd certainly encourage you to do so. All right. Well, I appreciate your time again, guys. I hope you have a good rest of the day and rest of the conference. And I certainly thank you for coming.